Good evening, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Paul Karitzis, and I'll be continuing the discussion on Emanuel Swedenborg. A critical examination of his biblical theology brings to light a multitude of other esoteric influences as well. Contemporary with Swedenborg was William Law, a prominent disciple of German mystic and theologian Jacob Bohm. Law's theology stayed fiercely faithful to Bohm's dualistic conception of God, which entertained the controversial notion that objectified evil balances objectified good in his divine anatomy. Swedenborg distanced himself from the aforementioned Christian theosophers by stressing that he had never read any of their works, though striking parallels between the philosophical ruminations and his own definitely fuels speculation. Foremost was the idea of God as an inexhaustible and everlasting entity that formed from the intercourse of conflicting forces like water and fire, evil and good, male and female, inertia and activity, and so forth. His sapience, awareness and ethereal being delimited the laws and precincts of the higher empyrean, the spiritual world. Situated in a subordinate part of heaven was the angelic world, a realm in which the conjunction of intrapersonal forces within God's eternal nature required a more tangible existence. Underneath the first two metaphysical tiers was a debased and flawed physical one fashioned by a cluster of fallen angels. The first two observed strict harmony and uniformity. The last, on the other hand, was a dissociative realm in which chaos, irreconcilable differences, and imbalance reigned supreme. Humans were in effect fallen angels, double beings comprised of spirit souls that had become entrapped in the dross of physical bodies. The subsistence to all tiers of the cosmological totem pole was a blessing in disguise, for God could at once descend upon the earth in the personage of Jesus Christ to unclog the spiritual path and reinstate to all mortal denizens their divine inheritance. Remarkably, Bohm's pensive fatalism didn't extend to Law, who predicted that it was only a matter of time before a salvific phenomenon such as collective redemption finally unravelled. Swedenborg was able to attract Beckmanists and practitioners of mystical theology like Thomas Hartley, Ezra Stills, and John William Fletcher precisely because he espoused analogous views. Moreover, Swedenborg claimed that many of the unorthodox ideas pertaining to his doctrine of the divine word were exhumed through visitations to the spirit world, a notion emphatically countered by contemporary scholarship which gravitates on the opinion that they were unconsciously sourced from esoteric philosophy. From his comprehensive knowledge of the Jewish and Christian Kabbalah, Swedenborg ascertained that biblical exegesis contained a cryptic interpretation. Indeed, God had fashioned the divine message of Holy Scripture from polygonal clay that made it intelligible to the hitherto untutored ears of man, whilst at the same time awakening the intuitive and spiritually inclined among them to those contours and ridges impregnated by much more profound and mystical denotations. This law of accommodation was neither unique nor original to Swedenborg, for it had typified the religious thought of the Christian deists, as well as Moses ben Maimon, a distinguished Jewish philosopher. Following along a path cleaved by the Kabbalists, he was also inclined to view letters, vows, and consonants of individual words contained within Scripture as encompassing magical or supernatural powers. Swedenborg's inimitable metaphysical process of revelation, so his spirit vision, bequeathed divine truths and techniques that enabled a correct interpretation of biblical scripture. The same totalitarian position was assumed by apocalyptic millenarians Joseph Mead and John Hutchinson, as well as scholastic disciples of the latter like Duncan Forbes, John Parkhurst, and William Jones. Hence, even before the gates of the spiritual world were flung open by his all-defining visionary experience of 1745, Swedenborg was already cognizant of all esoteric particulars that would coalesce under a Christian aegis when he assumed a self-appointed role as Hermetic messenger of the true Logos of God and interpreter of his will. Of course, the creative integration of esoteric motives into a new Christianity enabled Swedenborg to plausibly assume a role of mediumship through which the seventh and final expose in the Book of Revelation might garner expression. The latter adhered to purely spiritual concerns, or, as the apocalyptic Swedenborg would put it, to the spiritual contents of Scripture. The nature of these spiritual contents were explicated in Arcana Coelestium, published in 1758, his colossal commentary on Genesis and Exodus, in addition to the more comprehensive The True Christian Religion, which was published in 1771, both of which internalized the anticipated second incarnation of the Messiah and the Last Judgment foretold in the Book of Revelation. This interior process commenced in 1757, intending to reacquaint man with the spiritual realm bereft of collective consciousness through the true meaning of biblical scripture, and restore balance between material and ethereal worlds. In transposing this holy truth from a presupposed literal to a higher ethereal level, Swedenborg was reiterating God's superpersonal nature. The material crucifixion of Jesus Christ never intended to atone for Adamic sin simply because the latter was a trivial matter unworthy of his attention. God was entirely transcendent, and atonement was entirely unjustified. For all their brooding on theological matters, one has to wonder why this reasonable and coherent surmise never occurred to any of the other Christian philosophers or founding fathers. Swedenborg's spiritual crisis commenced when he was about 56. It was motivated by unaddressed unconscious elements, a psychic build-up of apprehension, suspicion, and confusion about the direction of his life that burst forth into consciousness as a series of strange and disturbing dreams. Their potency and eeriness was such that Swedenborg felt the need to transcribe them into a personal diary that became the Journal of Dreams, written between 1743 and 1744. A brief glimpse of it reveals a cluster of dream imagery that is both variegated and intoxicating. In one, he becomes entangled in the spinning wheel of a machine that disengages from its parent body before spiraling out of control. In another, he witnesses a gardener purging bedbugs from a grove of plants right after having brooded on the purchase of a new bed. Women were often cast in protagonistic roles as devourers and nurturers, illuminating what can only be unaddressed sexual repression or frustration. They were ominous demons equipped with teethed vaginas one minute, and supernal guardian angels rigorously ascertaining the cause of his distrust the next. Whatever the content or context, these were all musings of a vastly stressed, unbalanced and dissatisfied unconscious. Often he would enter altered states of consciousness for prolonged periods, vacillating between ordinary wakefulness and hypnotic trance, a passive viewer of this coming and going process until the culminating vision of April the 7th, 1744, in Wellclose Square in London, unfolded, where these visions suddenly acquired an unambiguous and perceptive character. It begins with a violent tempest that ensnares Swedenborg and hurls him onto the ground like a ragged doll. He addresses a prayer to Jesus Christ, who henceforth materializes in all his majesty and inaugurates a cryptic conversation intended to motivate him. The following April, Jesus appears again, this time through an intermediary consciousness between sleeping and waking, known as a semi-hypnotic or hypnagogic state, to clarify the essentials of an apostolic mission vouchsafed to Swedenborg alone. With his paraphysical faculty of mediumship now open, Swedenborg was free to explore the correspondence between the physical world and the worlds beyond at will, and hence cultivate a rudimentary theology. In theological and visionary treatises like The Divine Law and Wisdom, Heaven and Hell, and The True Christian Religion, all published in 1758, anonymously at first, he described avid intercourse with spirits, both angels and devils, who shed light upon such circumstantial mysteries as the dual composition of human beings, eschatology and after-death states, and the anatomy of divine love. His main contention is that once a spirit soul becomes ensnared in the physical world, the development of its psychological and moral habits are contingent upon the action of environmental forces. This evolution, substantial in the material world, does not cease upon physical corruption, but pinches out any sensory input so that the now inwardly turned and disembodied conscious can progress along a mental condition delineated by the repository of stored memories acquired during its corporeal lifetime. These modes of being do not determine whether one will ascend into heaven or descend into hell, for they are heaven and hell. Hence, heaven and hell are states of mind that subsist after death. Here, Swedenborg's inventiveness in creatively integrating occult or esoteric ideas into Christian theology is laid bare for all to see. Indeed, his visionary theology brings to mind the contemporary axiom that heaven and hell are where we make it. In Swedenborg's eyes, the perpetual dialogue between the physical brain and body, termed the outer or natural man, and the incorporeal mind, dubbed the inner or spiritual man, give birth to one's character or personality. These bundles of biological and psychological impulses, apprehended by habit, are more or less inclined to an archetypal sentiment that governs all creation, that is to say, love the common good or hate the common evil. For the time that he remains alive, man is rooted to a realm of time and space in which his personality is moulded, shaped, bent, reformed and cast according to information gathered by the sensory organs. When he finally passes into the realm of dead, his disembodied mind, that being the inner or spiritual man, continues to exist in a timeless zone of thoughts and ideas, though in a state analogous to the prevailing sentiments of the outer man. By virtue of this fact, inclinations and tendencies in the world beyond are, to all intents and purposes, predetermined. Swedenborg maintained that the ethereal dimensions were divided into 7 tiers, much like the individual rungs of a ladder. At the top was a tripartite subdivision of heaven into natural, angelic and celestial regions. The nethermost part was taken up by a tripartite subdivision of hell, and between the two lay a transitional realm harbouring the recently departed. The transitional world, dubbed psychonoetic by some seers and mystics, cleverly mimics the landscapes and contours of the physical plane so that a recently deceased might be fooled into thinking he's still alive. Nevertheless, a gradual turning inward of personal consciousness, sparked by the death of the outer man, orientates the inner man to his spiritual north. Heeded by a like-minded spirit, either an angel or a demon, the inner man can ascend or descend the multidimensional ladder and network with societies of beings that exhibit the same psychic disposition. A placid and altruistic temperament, in conjunction with love for God, others and the collective interest are rewarded with spiritual freedom or ascension into the heavenly spheres. Alternatively, the narcissistic and those motivated by personal hedonism are subjected to abject servitude, of course, sinking lower and lower into the Stygian darkness of the infernal regions. If every inhabitant of the netherworld was formerly human, as Swedenborg would have us believe, then heaven and hell are states of mind that one identifies with during life and assumes permanently in the guise of angel and devil upon death. No discussion of Swedenborg's esoteric spirituality would be complete without a brief look at the visionary faculty through which all revelations pertaining to his contemplative theology were made. Swedenborg affirms he could consciously descry the external physical plane and the internal spiritual one simultaneously, entering and leaving the latter at will. Might there be any objective truth to such a claim? Swedenborg's intellectual career and legacy are quick to offer up the first clues. Looking at his life from a holistic perspective, there is no evidence of a swift rise to fame followed by notoriety and decline that typifies, for instance, the dubious mediums and magicians like Edward Kelly and Aleister Crowley. Following his death, his philosophy transformed into a sect, the Swedenborgians, who influenced 19th century esotericism in England and America. In addition, Swedenborg's visionary descriptions of amphitheatres, parks, colleges, palaces and other places are remarkably detailed and descriptive, and preternaturally so. They're a world away from the parabolic displays that typify the written discourse of pathological liars. These terms jettison the notion that he may have been a charlatan. And that concludes part 2, and I will see you soon for part 3.